There is a moment that happens in almost every long relationship, and almost nobody talks about it out loud. You are lying next to someone you love, someone you chose, someone who still makes you laugh. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet question surfaces. Why doesn't this feel the way it used to? If you have ever asked yourself that question and then felt guilty for asking it, you are not broken, and you are not alone. You are experiencing one of the most well-documented, most misunderstood patterns in human intimacy. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why it happens, what your brain is doing behind the scenes, and what science actually says about rebuilding connection without shame. Let's start with a number that surprises most people. Researchers who study long-term couples have found that sexual desire, on average, begins to shift within the first 1 to 3 years of a committed relationship, regardless of how much two people love each other. This is not a sign of failure. It is closer to a biological schedule than a personal one. And yet, when it happens, most people interpret it as heartbreak. They think something is wrong with them, or wrong with their partner, or wrong with the relationship itself. What if the truth is far less frightening and far more human than that? To understand what is really going on, we have to go back to the brain, because desire does not begin in the body. It begins in a small cluster of neural circuits that evolution built for an entirely different purpose than modern love. When two people first meet, the brain releases a flood of dopamine, the chemical most associated with anticipation, novelty, and reward. This is the same chemical system that lights up when you try a new restaurant, hear a song for the first time, or explore an unfamiliar city. In early attraction, another person is, quite literally, the most novel and unpredictable stimulus your brain has encountered in years. That unpredictability is not a side effect of falling in love. It is engine of it. But dopamine was never designed to sustain itself forever. It is a chemical of pursuit, not of arrival. Once the brain fully maps a person, their habits, their voice, their routines, the way they breathe when they sleep, the element of surprise begins to fade, and so does the intensity of that dopamine response. This is not romantic pessimism, it is neuroscience. Predictability, the very thing that makes a relationship feel safe, is also the thing that quiets the brain's reward circuitry. Safety and spontaneity pull in opposite directions, and almost nobody warns couples about this trade-off before they experience it firsthand. This is where most people make their first mistake. They assume that a dip in desire means a dip in love. But researchers who study attachment have found something quite different. As the dopamine-driven excitement of early romance settles, a second, quieter system tends to rise in its place, built around oxytocin and vasopressin, chemicals associated with bonding, trust, and long-term attachment. In other words, your brain is not falling out of love. It is switching operating systems, from short-term thrill to long-term stability. The problem is that almost nobody explains this transition, so couples panic in the space between one chemical system fading and the other taking hold. Here is where it gets more interesting, because desire itself is not one single thing. Psychologists studying human sexuality distinguish between two very different types of arousal. The first is called spontaneous desire, that sudden, out-of-nowhere spark that shows up uninvited. The second is called responsive desire, arousal that builds gradually, often only after physical or emotional closeness has already begun. Early in a relationship, spontaneous desire tends to dominate because novelty itself is arousing. But over time, for a large percentage of people, especially in long-term partnerships, responsive desire becomes the primary pathway. This single distinction resolves an enormous amount of unnecessary guilt. If you no longer spontaneously arouse the way you once did, that does not mean desire is gone. It may simply mean your body is waiting for an invitation rather than issuing one on its own. Understanding this can change the entire emotional tone of a relationship. Because so many people quietly measure their love by how often desire appears out of nowhere. When it doesn't, they assume the connection is dying. But responsive desire is not a lesser form of intimacy. In many long-term studies, it is actually the more common and more sustainable pattern, particularly once the initial novelty phase of a relationship has passed. The people who understand this distinction tend to feel far less anxiety about their own bodies and far more curiosity about what actually helps responsive desire show up. So what does help it show up? This is where lifestyle and biology intersect in ways that rarely get discussed. Chronic stress, for example, activates the body's sympathetic nervous system, flooding it with cortisol, a hormone that is fundamentally at odds with sexual arousal. The nervous system cannot fully mobilize for both threat and intimacy at the same time. This is why desire so often disappears during periods of high stress, financial pressure, new parenthood, or unresolved conflict, even when love for a partner has not changed at all. The body is simply prioritizing survival over connection, exactly as it evolved to do. Sleep plays a similarly underestimated role. Research on sleep deprivation has repeatedly shown reduced testosterone levels in men and lower reported arousal in women after even a single night of poor sleep. In a culture that treats exhaustion as a badge of honor, this single factor may be quietly dismantling more relationships than infidelity ever has. It is rarely dramatic. It is rarely about. It simply accumulates night after night, until two people who love each other feel strangely distant without ever understanding why. Then there is the question almost every long-term couple eventually faces, but almost never say out loud. What happens to desire once it becomes routine? Human brains are prediction machines. We are wired to notice change and to stop noticing what stays the same. This is why the 100th time you drive a familiar route, you barely remember the details, but a new route captures your full attention. Intimacy is not exempt from this pattern. When physical connection follows the exact same script every time, the brain begins to file it under the familiar, the automatic, the background. This is not a character flaw in either partner. It is simply how attention itself works. This is also where a common misconception causes real damage. Many people assume that a loss of novelty in intimacy means a loss of compatibility, so instead of exploring the issue together, they quietly separate from it, either physically or emotionally. But the research points to something more hopeful. Couples who introduce even modest forms of shared novelty into their lives, new activities, new environments, new conversations, new physical experiences, tend to report higher relationship satisfaction and renewed feelings of attraction toward their partner. This is sometimes called the self-expansion model in relationship psychology. The idea is simple. Human beings are drawn to growth. When a partner becomes a source of new experiences again, rather than a fixed and fully known variable, the brain's reward system reactivates, at least partially, echoing that original dopamine response from early attraction. This does not mean novelty has to be extreme or elaborate. Something as simple as learning a new skill together, traveling somewhere unfamiliar, or having a genuinely new kind of conversation can measurably shift how partners perceive each other. The brain does not require constant reinvention. It requires enough unpredictability to stay engaged, layered on top of the safety that long-term bonding provides. The healthiest relationships, according to attachment researchers, tend to hold both forces at once, closeness and curiosity, stability and surprise, without letting either one fully disappear. But biology and novelty are only half the story, because there is a psychological layer underneath all of this that shapes everything else. And it has almost nothing to do with technique. It has to do with communication, and more specifically, with the fear that keeps people from communicating in the first place. Ask any therapist who works with couples, and you will hear a version of the same observation. It is rarely the desire gap itself that damages a relationship. It is the silence that grows around it. One partner senses a shift, interprets it as rejection, and withdraws to protect themselves. The other partner senses the withdrawal, interprets it as disinterest, and withdraws in response. Within a few months, two people who both still love each other have built an invisible wall out of nothing but unspoken assumptions. Why is this conversation so hard to start? Part of the answer lives in early development. Most people were never taught by parents, schools, or culture how to talk about desire, bodies, or intimacy in a calm, matter-of-fact way. Instead, many grew up absorbing subtle messages that sexuality is something to be hidden, joked about, or approached with anxiety. Those early messages do not disappear in adulthood. They resurface, quietly, in the pause before someone tries to bring up an uncomfortable topic with a partner they trust completely. The fear is rarely about the partner's reaction. It is about old shame resurfacing at the worst possible moment. Psychologists who study vulnerability describe this as one of the core paradoxes of long-term intimacy. The longer two people are together, the safer the relationship theoretically becomes, and yet many people report that certain conversations feel harder over time, not easier. Why? Because the emotional stakes have grown. Early in a relationship, there is less to lose. Years in, there is an entire shared life on the line, and that awareness alone can make people freeze rather than speak. This is not weakness. It is the mind protecting something it values deeply. So how do healthy relationships actually navigate this? Not with grand gestures. With small, low-pressure openings. Naming that a conversation feels difficult before having it instantly lowers the emotional temperature. 4 words can do it. This feels vulnerable. That's it. The partner's nervous system hears safety instead of attack, and defensiveness never gets the chance to switch on. Timing changes everything too. Raise a sensitive topic during conflict, and the brain is already in defense mode. It will not listen. It will only protect. Raise the same topic in a calm, unhurried moment, and the odds of being met with curiosity instead of fear rise sharply. Nobody teaches this, but researchers who study couples keep finding it again and again. There is one more shift that changes everything: language. "You don't excite me anymore" points a finger. "I've noticed something new about myself I'd love to explore with you" opens a door. Same underlying feeling. Two completely outcomes. It is worth pausing here to address a broader misconception that fuels a great deal of unnecessary anxiety. Many people quietly believe that a truly compatible couple should not have to work at intimacy at all, that if the connection were strong enough, desire would simply stay constant on its own. This belief, while comforting on the surface, is not supported by what researchers actually observe in long-term couples. Nearly every long-term relationship experiences some form of desire fluctuation. The presence of that fluctuation is not evidence of incompatibility. The way two people respond to it is what tends to predict long-term relationship satisfaction far more reliably than the fluctuation itself. This reframe matters because shame thrives in silence, and silence is exactly what most people default to when they believe their experience is abnormal. When someone quietly assumes they are the only person whose desire has shifted, they are far less likely to seek support, far less likely to bring it up with their partner, and far more likely to internalize the change as a personal failure. But when the same experience is understood as a well-documented, biologically explainable pattern shared by the vast majority of long-term couples, something shifts. The shame loosens its grip and curiosity becomes possible again. There is also a broader cultural layer worth acknowledging honestly. As conversations around relationships continue to evolve, more people are openly discussing different relationship structures, communication styles, and expectations around intimacy than in previous generations. This does not mean one structure is superior to another. What it does suggest is a growing recognition that no single blueprint fits every couple, and that the healthiest relationships tend to be the ones where both feel genuinely able to what they need, without fear of judgment, rather than silently performing an expectation neither of them actually chose. None of this is about applying pressure to manufacture desire on demand, and it is important to be clear about that. Desire cannot be forced, and trying to force it often backfires, increasing anxiety and further suppressing the very arousal someone is chasing. What the research actually supports is something gentler, creating the conditions in which desire is more likely to arise naturally, reducing chronic stress where possible, protecting sleep, introducing shared novelty without expectation attached to it, practicing small, low-stakes emotional honesty long before any conversation about intimacy becomes urgent. These are not overnight fixes, and no responsible source should present them as guarantees. They are simply patterns that researchers have observed correlating with stronger, more resilient long-term connection. It is also worth saying plainly that fluctuations in desire are not always psychological or relational. Hormonal changes, certain medications, underlying health conditions, and major life transitions such as pregnancy, postpartum recovery, or menopause can all significantly influence libido, independent of relationship quality. This is precisely why blanket assumptions are so unhelpful, and why a licensed medical professional or qualified therapist, rather than internet speculation, should always be the first point of contact when changes in desire feel distressing, sudden, or persistent. Self-diagnosis in this area, more than almost any other, tends to create unnecessary fear rather than clarity. Perhaps the most reassuring insight from decades of relationship research is this: long-term intimacy is not a fixed resource that quietly depletes over the years, no matter how it may feel in a difficult season. It behaves more like a living system, one that responds to attention, communication, rest, and shared experience. Couples who understand this tend to treat a quiet season not as an ending, but as information, a signal pointing towards stress that needs addressing, novelty that has faded, or a conversation that has been avoided for too long. Couples who misunderstand it often treat the same quiet season as a verdict, and in doing so sometimes turn a temporary pattern into a permanent one, simply by responding to it with silence and withdrawal instead of curiosity. So here is the question worth sitting with long after this video ends: not whether desire changes over time, because it almost certainly will for nearly everyone at some point. The more meaningful question is what you choose to do with that change when it arrives. Do you interpret it as evidence that something is broken and quietly retreat into silence? Or do you recognize it for what the science actually suggests it usually is: a normal, biologically grounded shift that opens a deeper honesty, rather than a wall that ends the conversation? The body changes, the brain changes, relationships change. What tends to determine whether two people grow closer or further apart is rarely the change itself. It is whether they are willing to talk about it, together, with patience, without shame, and without expecting either love or desire to look exactly the way it did the day they met.